The Millionaire's arranged marriage to a homeless girl for one night, but he falls deeply in love. Hello, my beautiful family and dear friends. I hope you're all doing well. Today, I'm speaking to you with a heavy heart, feeling a bit down because I've noticed my viewership decreasing day by day. It's disheartening, especially when I pour my heart and soul into creating these stories for you, working tirelessly, 14 to 15 hours a day, just to bring you something special. But you, my incredible audience, are the reason I keep going. Your love, your support, and your words of encouragement mean everything to me. If my stories have ever touched your heart, inspired you, or made you feel something deep inside, please let me know in the comments. Your feedback is what keeps me motivated to continue. I truly need your support on this journey. If you believe in my stories, if you want me to keep creating, please subscribe, share, and let me know your thoughts. Your kindness and encouragement fuel my passion. Now let's dive into today's story. I've poured my heart into it just for you. Let's begin. Ethan Blackwood sat in his penthouse office, the skyline of New York stretching endlessly before him. The city was his empire, every towering building a reflection of his ruthless ambition. The world feared him, respected him, but never got close enough to love him. And that was exactly how he wanted it. But now, everything he had built was under threat. He clenched his jaw, gripping the whiskey glass in his hand. The ice clinked against the crystal as he swirled the dark liquid, his mind replaying his grandfather's ultimatum over and over again. Get married in 48 hours, or lose everything. Ethan scoffed, his grip tightening around the glass. The demand was absurd. A man like him didn't do marriage. He barely tolerated relationships that lasted longer than a business trip. Love, commitment, that was a weakness. For years, he had prided himself on being untouchable, a force of nature in the corporate world. He had crushed competitors, dismantled businesses, and rebuilt them in his own image. Every move he made was calculated, every emotion buried under layers of steel, and now he was being told that all of it, his empire, his legacy, his life's work, depended on something as ridiculous as a wedding ring. His fingers flexed against the glass before he set it down on the sleek mahogany desk. He didn't want to be here, fuming over something so trivial. But his grandfather, Richard Blackwood, wasn't a man to make idle threats. Ethan had seen it in his eyes earlier that morning, the unwavering determination of a man who had built $1 billion empire from nothing. His grandfather had once been just like him, ruthless and sharp. But somewhere along the way, the old man had softened. He had started talking about things like legacy, family, love. And now he was forcing that outdated ideology onto Ethan. "You need to think beyond money, Ethan," his grandfather had said, his gaze piercing. "You run this company like a machine, but you forget that a machine can be replaced. Family, legacy, those are the things that keep an empire alive." Ethan had folded his arms, his expression cold. "I built this company. I don't need a wife to prove my worth." Richard had simply smirked. "Then prove it by walking away." That had stopped Ethan in his tracks. His grandfather's voice had been calm, but the underlying challenge had been clear. Ethan either played by his rules, or he lost everything. The thought sent fire through his veins. The very word made his skin crawl. But he wasn't a man who accepted defeat. If his grandfather wanted a wedding, fine. He would give him one. But on his own terms, Ethan exhaled sharply and pressed a button on his desk intercom. "Rebecca, get in here." Within seconds, the glass door to his office slid open, and Rebecca Hayes walked in. She was tall, poised, and impeccably dressed as always. Her sharp mind was one of the few he trusted, and for years she had handled his business affairs flawlessly. She arched a perfectly groomed brow. "You need something, Mr. Blackwood?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "Find me a wife." Rebecca blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he said, his voice flat. "I need a wife. Fast." Rebecca hesitated. For the first time since she had started working for him, she looked speechless. "Sir, marriage isn't something you can order like a business acquisition," Ethan smirked. "Of course it is. Everything in life is a transaction." She exhaled, shaking her head. "I assume this has something to do with your grandfather's ultimatum." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Find me a woman who will sign the contract, take the money, and disappear when I say so." Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line. "So, you want someone desperate?" "Precisely," Ethan said, his tone razor-sharp. "No socialites, no women who think they're getting a fairy tale. I need someone who understands that this is a deal, nothing more." Rebecca folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "And if she says no?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at his lips. "She won't." Rebecca sighed, but she knew better than to argue. "Fine, I'll handle it. But I hope you understand that marriage, even a fake one, has consequences." Ethan waved a dismissive hand. "This won't last long enough for consequences." Rebecca gave him one last knowing look before turning on her heel and walking out of the office. The moment she was gone, Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temple. This is just business, a contract. It was nothing more than a formality, a minor inconvenience before he could return to the life he had built. No woman, especially a temporary wife, could change that. At least, that's what he believed. At the other end, Lily Hart pulled her thin jacket tighter around her body as the cold night air bit into her skin. The city was alive with lights, laughter, and the hum of a world that had long forgotten her. She sat on the damp pavement outside a cozy little cafe, the golden glow from inside spilling onto the wet sidewalk, casting her in a light that didn't belong to her world. She wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to be this. Once she had a family, a home, a life filled with love and warmth. But fate had been cruel. One by one, everything had been stripped away from her. First, her parents. A tragic accident had stolen them from her when she was just 16, leaving her with nothing but a mountain of unpaid medical bills and a landlord who had no patience for an orphan with empty pockets. Then, her home. She had fought. God. She had fought to keep the tiny apartment that held the last remnants of her childhood. But the world didn't care about struggle. It cared about money, and money was something she no longer had. At 19, she found herself with nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and no hope left to cling to. Now, at 22, she had learned how to survive the streets, how to find shelter in abandoned buildings, how to blend into the shadows, unnoticed and forgotten. But she had never learned how to stop wanting. Her tired brown eyes lingered on the couples inside the cafe, their hands intertwined over steaming cups of coffee. They laughed, talked, and existed in a world so far removed from her own that it felt like a cruel dream. Would she ever belong anywhere again? A sudden gust of wind sent a violent shiver down her spine. Her clothes, already damp from the relentless rain, clung to her frame, offering no protection from the cold. She hugged her knees to her chest, willing herself to stop shaking. She shouldn't have stopped here. Sitting in front of a cafe like some tragic movie scene wouldn't change her reality. And yet she couldn't bring herself to leave, because for a few stolen moments she could pretend. She could pretend she wasn't hungry, that she wasn't alone, that life hadn't abandoned her. The scent of freshly baked bread and rich coffee drifted through the air, taunting her empty stomach. She tried to remember the last real meal she had. Days ago? Weeks? She had lost track. A waitress stepped outside carrying a tray of used dishes to dump into the bins. Lily quickly looked away, bracing herself for the usual disgusted glance, the look of someone seeing something they didn't want to acknowledge. But the waitress didn't sneer. Instead, she hesitated before digging into her apron pocket and pulling out a wrapped muffin. Without a word, she set it on the ledge beside Lily and walked back inside. Lily stared at it, her chest tightening. Kindness. It was rare, almost non-existent in her world. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the muffin, her hunger momentarily battling her pride. But pride wouldn't fill her stomach. She unwrapped it carefully, taking the smallest bite, letting the taste of cinnamon and sugar melt on her tongue. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She wasn't crying because she was sad. She was crying because she was still human enough to feel. The rain picked up again, heavier this time. She pulled her knees closer, trying to make herself smaller against the cold. She needed to find shelter for the night, somewhere away from the biting wind and the dangers that lurked in the dark. But just as she was about to force herself up, a sleek black car pulled to a stop in front of the cafe. Lily barely paid attention at first. Fancy cars were a common sight in this part of the city. But then the back door opened, and everything changed. A tall man stepped out, dressed in an impossibly expensive suit. His presence alone seemed to command the air around him, as if the very city bent to his will. He didn't belong in this world, and neither did she. Lily's gaze flickered up to meet his, for the briefest of moments before she quickly looked away. Men like him didn't see women like her, but tonight, fate had other plans. Rebecca Hayes had handled impossible tasks before. As Ethan Blackwood's assistant, she had managed hostile takeovers, navigated billion-dollar mergers, and kept the world's most ruthless businessman from losing his mind. But tonight, she had to find him a bride. In less than 24 hours, she gritted her teeth, scanning the streets from the passenger seat of the sleek black Bentley. Her fingers drummed impatiently on her phone as she flipped through her contacts. Socialites, models, even actresses, all rejected. No one was desperate enough to sign a one-night marriage contract and disappear. She needed someone with nothing to lose. And that's when she saw her, a frail figure, huddled outside a cafe, drenched from the rain, clutching a half-eaten muffin like it was the last piece of kindness in the world. Rebecca narrowed her eyes. No family, no home, no expectations. She turned sharply to the driver. "Stop the car!" The vehicle rolled to a halt in front of the cafe, and Rebecca stepped out, heels clicking against the wet pavement. The woman, barely more than a girl, really, tensed, her tired, brown eyes flickering with caution. Rebecca had seen that look before, hunger, weariness, and the weight of a world that had been endlessly cruel. Good. It meant she wouldn't say no. "Are you looking for work?" Rebecca asked, cutting straight to the point. The girl blinked, as if trying to process whether the question was real. What?" "Work," Rebecca repeated. "A job. You need one, don't you?" Lily hesitated. Was this a trick? Some cruel joke? But Rebecca looked serious. Her clothes screamed wealth. Her polished demeanor oozed power. Lily swallowed hard. I do." Rebecca's lips curved. "Good. Get in the car." Lily froze. "What kind of job?" Rebecca's smirk didn't falter. "One that will change your life." Ethan Blackwood sat in his private lounge, whiskey in hand, checking his watch for the 10th time. Rebecca had 30 minutes before he fired her. He didn't have time for games. He needed a woman who would sign the damn contract, marry him for a single night, and then disappear. No emotions, no complications. When the door finally opened, he exhaled sharply. Rebecca walked in, her expression unreadable. And behind her, Ethan's brows lifted. The girl was nothing like the women he was used to. She was small, too thin, as if life had wrung her dry. Her wet clothes clung to her fragile frame, and her brown eyes flickered with weariness. Yet despite it all, there was a quiet dignity about her, a strength in the way she held her chin up, as if daring the world to break her again. Rebecca spoke first. "Mr. Blackwood, meet Lily Hart." Lily swallowed, her pulse hammering. She was no stranger to powerful men. She had seen them from the outside, through windows of fancy restaurants, driving past in cars she would never set foot in. But standing in front of Ethan Blackwood, he wasn't just powerful. He was lethal. Tall, broad-shouldered, ice-blue eyes that could strip someone bare with a single glance. He exuded wealth, but it wasn't the kind that came with privilege. It was the kind that came from ruthlessness, and he was looking at her like she was nothing. Lily's stomach clenched. "What am I doing here?" Ethan set his whiskey down, his voice like steel. "She's a mess!" Lily flinched, shame burning through her. Rebecca sighed. "She's perfect for what you need." Ethan's eyes flickered with disinterest. "She looks like a stray cat." Lily clenched her fists. She knew she wasn't beautiful like the women in his world. She wasn't polished or sophisticated, but she wasn't a stray. Rebecca leaned in, lowering her voice. "She has no family, no ties, no one who will ask questions. You need a wife for one night. She needs a way to survive. This is business, Ethan, not a romance." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temple. He didn't have time for arguments. His gaze locked onto Lily. "Do you understand what's being offered to you?" Lily forced herself to nod. "A job," Ethan smirked. "Not a job. A deal." Lily's throat tightened. Ethan leaned forward, his presence suffocating. "Marry me. For one night. In exchange, you'll have food, money, and a place to stay. Once the contract ends, you disappear." The words hung in the air, cold and calculated. Lily's mind spun. A marriage. Even if it was fake, even if it was just for one night, the idea made her stomach churn. But she was starving. She had nowhere to sleep tonight, and this man, this ruthless, arrogant millionaire, was offering her something she hadn't had in years. She took a shaky breath. "And after the night is over?" Ethan's smirk deepened. "You get your money, and I forget you exist." The cruelty in his words stung. But Lily had no pride left to protect. She looked down at the contract Rebecca placed in front of her. Black ink, precise terms. She had nothing, and this was something Her hands trembled as she reached for the pen. For a single, fleeting second, she wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. And then she signed her name, never realizing that this single, cold-blooded deal would change her forever. Lily Hart stood in front of the massive gilded mirror, staring at the girl reflected in its polished surface. She barely recognized herself. The dress was beautiful, a vision of white satin and lace, its delicate embroidery glistening under the golden chandeliers of Ethan Blackwood's mansion. The fabric clung to her slender frame, cinching at the waist before cascading down in a waterfall of elegance. It wasn't hers. Nothing in this world belonged to her. Not the dress, not the mansion, not the man she was about to marry. She swallowed, her throat dry despite the champagne they had forced into her hand earlier. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed down the bodice, trying to calm the rapid beating of her heart. This wasn't a real wedding. This wasn't real love. It was a transaction, a contract signed in desperation, a single night of marriage in exchange for survival. And yet, standing here dressed like a bride, she felt an ache deep in her chest. An ache she couldn't explain, couldn't name, but one that made her feel utterly alone. Behind her, Rebecca's voice cut through the silence. "It's time." Lily inhaled sharply, nodding. She could do this, even if her groom was a man who saw her as nothing more than a pawn in his game. The grand hall of Ethan Blackwood's mansion was breathtaking, draped in the finest white roses, crystal chandeliers casting a warm golden glow over the elegant room. It was a picture-perfect wedding, except for one thing. There was no joy, no guests, no celebration, just a handful of lawyers and witnesses, strangers in expensive suits, gathered only to ensure the legalities were met. And in the center of it all stood Ethan Blackwood. He was dressed in a tailored black suit, standing with his hands in his pockets, exuding an air of indifference. His ice-blue eyes flicked toward the grand staircase as Lily descended, her small, delicate frame swallowed by the extravagance of the dress. For a brief moment, something flickered in his gaze, something unreadable, something almost human. But then it was gone, replaced by the same detached coldness he had worn since the day she met him. Lily reached the bottom of the stairs, her heart pounding as she walked toward him. No one took her arm. No one gave her away. She was alone. The officiant cleared his throat. "We are gathered here today," Ethan cut him off with a sharp tone. "Skip to the vows." A murmur of unease passed through the room, but the officiant nodded. Lily bit the inside of her cheek. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was a business deal. Ethan turned to face her, his expression blank as he spoke the words with the same disinterest he might use in a boardroom negotiation. "I, Ethan Blackwood, take you, Lily Hart, to be my lawfully wedded wife for tonight and tonight only. I promise to uphold the terms of our agreement, and when the night ends, so does this marriage." A hushed silence fell over the room. Even the witnesses shifted uncomfortably at his brutal honesty. Lily felt a lump rise in her throat, but she pushed it down. It didn't matter. She knew what she had signed up for. Her fingers tightened around the bouquet as she forced her voice to remain steady. "I, Lily Hart, take you, Ethan Blackwood, to be my lawfully wedded husband," she whispered. Her voice was soft, trembling slightly, but filled with something his was not, because even though this marriage wasn't real to him, she couldn't bring herself to lie. She meant her words, even if he never would. The officiant hesitated before nodding. "You may now kiss the bride." A cruel smirk ghosted across Ethan's lips. He stepped forward, placing a single hand under her chin. Lily braced herself for the cold, meaningless press of his lips, but at the last second, he merely leaned in, so close she could feel his breath against her skin, before whispering, "That won't be necessary." Then he pulled away. "Let's get this over with." Lily's stomach twisted, embarrassment heating her cheeks. The officiant cleared his throat. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Silence. No applause. No smiles. Just a contract sealed with ice rather than fire. Ethan turned away immediately, not even sparing her a glance. Without a word, without acknowledgement, he strode toward the doors, leaving her standing there, drowning in the weight of a name that didn't belong to her. A name she would only carry for one night. A name that meant nothing to the man who had just given it to her. As the doors shut behind him, Lily exhaled shakily, her chest tightening with a strange, unfamiliar pain. She had expected this. She had known exactly what this was. And yet, why did it still hurt? The night air inside the Blackwood estate was still, almost suffocatingly quiet. Every corner of the grand mansion was bathed in dim, golden light, reflecting off the opulent marble floors and the towering chandeliers that hung from the ceiling like frozen constellations. For most, this place was a dream, a symbol of power, wealth, and status. For Lily Hart, it felt alien. She stood in the grand bedroom assigned to her, eyes trailing across the silk-draped king-size bed, the extravagant furniture, the vast windows that overlooked the city skyline. The walls were lined with books she would never dare to touch, and the air smelled of fresh roses, expensive and delicate, like a world she didn't belong in. She stepped forward, reaching out to run her fingers over the smooth fabric of the bed. It looked too perfect, too untouched, like no one had ever truly slept here. Maybe that was the case. Maybe Ethan Blackwood, for all his wealth and power, never really rested. A small smile tugged at her lips as she imagined him pacing restlessly, unable to find peace even in all this luxury. Her smile faded. She shouldn't be thinking about him. This wasn't a real marriage. It was one night, nothing more. Tomorrow, she would sign whatever final paperwork needed signing, take the money, and walk away. That was the agreement. And yet, as she turned away from the bed, she knew she wouldn't be sleeping there. Ethan Blackwood sat in his private study, swirling a glass of whiskey between his fingers, irritation simmering beneath his carefully controlled exterior. The evening had been exhausting. The farce of a wedding. The lawyers, the business associates pretending not to be shocked that the cold, unattainable Ethan Blackwood had married a nobody. And through it all, Lily Hart had remained unshaken. No nervous stammering, no wide-eyed amazement at the wealth surrounding her. No greedy glances toward the priceless paintings, the rare artifacts, the ridiculous display of power. She had simply smiled and said, "Thank you." Ethan scowled, tossing back the rest of his drink. She was supposed to be overwhelmed, supposed to act like every other person he had encountered, awed, intimidated, desperate. Instead, she had accepted it all with a quiet grace that irritated him more than it should. What kind of woman was she, and why did she make him feel so unsettled? Ethan had never struggled with sleep. If his body demanded rest, he took it, simple, efficient, without hesitation. But tonight, something gnawed at him, something unfamiliar. With an annoyed sigh, he pushed himself up from his chair and made his way down the hall toward the bedroom where his temporary wife was staying. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Maybe her asleep in the oversized bed, tangled in the silk sheets, finally letting the weight of the day settle over her. Maybe her crying softly, realizing she had married a man who didn't love her, who never would. Instead, when he pushed the door open, he found her curled up on the couch. Not the massive, luxurious bed meant for royalty, the small, uncomfortable couch in the corner of the room, his brows furrowed. "What the hell are you doing?" Lily stirred, blinking sleepily before sitting up. "What?" Ethan took a step forward, his voice sharp. "Why aren't you sleeping in the bed?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "I'm used to small spaces." A strange sensation twisted in his chest, something tight, something painful. She wasn't saying it for pity. There was no self-consciousness in her voice, no expectation of sympathy. She was simply stating a fact. Because, of course, she was used to small spaces. She had spent nights on park benches, in abandoned buildings, in shelters where there was barely room to breathe. And now, even in a mansion, she still chose the smallest, most uncomfortable spot in the room. Ethan clenched his jaw. He should have walked away, should have ignored the strange, unwanted feeling creeping into his chest. Instead, he moved to the fireplace, running a hand through his hair as irritation burned through him. "This is ridiculous." Lily tilted her head. "Why?" "You're my wife for the night." His voice was edged with frustration, though he wasn't sure if it was directed at her or himself. "That means you sleep in the damn bed." Lily's lips curled into a small, teasing smile. I didn't realize marriage came with sleeping arrangements," Ethan scowled. "It does when you're married to me." For a moment, they just stared at each other. Lily, with her quiet defiance. Ethan, with his overwhelming need to understand why she didn't act like the world owed her something. Finally, with a sigh, she stood up. "Fine," she said, walking toward the bed. Ethan should have felt satisfied. Instead, the sight of her sitting hesitantly at the edge of the mattress made something in his chest ache. With a frustrated grunt, he turned toward the door. "Go to sleep," he muttered. And then, before he could do something stupid like apologize for snapping at her, he left. Back in his own bedroom, Ethan stared at the ceiling, his mind unable to settle. This woman, this infuriatingly calm woman, was supposed to be a nobody, a stranger. He had married out of convenience, and yet, in less than 24 hours, she had managed to unsettle him. Why did he care if she slept on a couch? Why did it bother him that she wasn't overwhelmed by luxury? Why did she make him feel like something inside of him was cracking? Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. This was nothing. Tomorrow she would be gone, and he would never think about her again. At least, that's what he told himself, but deep down, somewhere, he refused to acknowledge. He knew. This night had changed something, and no matter how much he fought it, Lily Hart wasn't going to be so easy to forget. The mansion was unnervingly quiet. The sound of the wind howling outside the tall windows of the Blackwood estate seemed louder than any noise Ethan had heard in the grand corridors. He was supposed to be in bed by now. A long day of forced smiles, legal documents, and an uncomfortable sense of impending finality. His mind should have been focused on everything that needed to be done. But instead, he found himself standing in the hallway, staring at the door to Lily's room. He had told himself it was over. One night of this absurdity, and then she'd be gone. The arrangement would end, and he could return to his normal life, his empire, his routine, his loneliness. Yet something inside him was pulling him back. Against all his better judgment, he found himself walking toward her room, his thoughts clouded by the image of her curled up on that tiny couch earlier. The door was slightly ajar, and as Ethan stepped inside, he saw her, Lily, sitting by the window, staring out into the night. The moonlight illuminated her face, and for a moment she seemed like a stranger, a beautiful, fragile stranger with eyes full of longing, but no hint of fear or desperation. His breath hitched for a split second. No matter how much he tried to convince himself otherwise, he could feel something shifting within him. This wasn't part of the plan. He hadn't expected her to affect him like this. "Why aren't you sleeping?" His voice was colder than he intended, but he couldn't help it. It had become a shield, something to protect him from the raw emotions she seemed to trigger without even trying. Lily turned, startled at first, but her gaze softened when she saw him standing there, unsure of what to do with himself. She had expected him to retreat back into his own world, to forget about her and the situation entirely. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, simply offering him a small smile. "Too many thoughts in my head." Ethan stared at her. He couldn't understand why she was so calm. Why wasn't she nervous or uncomfortable? Why wasn't she desperate for his attention, his approval, like everyone else he knew? He should have just turned and left, but instead he found himself walking towards her, his feet moving without his permission. "Are you always this calm?" he asked, sitting down beside her on the couch. Lily shrugged, her eyes never leaving the window. "I've learned to be," she said softly. "When you've lost everything, you don't have the luxury of panicking." For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. He just sat there, staring ahead, unsure of what to do. Silence stretched between them, uncomfortable at first. Ethan wasn't used to silence. He was used to the hum of power, to the constant buzz of his phone, the sound of deals being made, the clicking of heels on marble floors. This was different, and as much as he wanted to pull away, to dismiss this connection as insignificant, he felt himself drawn to it. "What's it like?" he asked suddenly. The question surprised even him. "Being alone." Lily turned to look at him, a quiet surprise flashing across her features. She hadn't expected him to ask such a personal question, but there was something in his eyes, something vulnerable, something human, that made her want to answer. So she did. "It's hard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but it teaches you things. It teaches you that you can survive without all the things most people think they need: love, money, stability. You learn that you're enough, no matter what." She paused, as if unsure whether she should continue, but then, looking at Ethan, she decided she could trust him with the truth. "And it teaches you not to rely on anyone, because the world will always let you down." Ethan was silent, her words piercing deeper than he cared to admit. He was used to people needing him, being drawn to him because of his wealth or his power. But Lily, this girl with nothing, wasn't interested in any of that. She wasn't trying to make him feel like a savior. She wasn't trying to get something out of him. The realization hit him harder than any business deal he had ever signed. A cool breeze swept through the room, making Lily shiver. Ethan noticed it immediately. Her skin was pale, almost fragile, and the thin gown she wore didn't offer much protection against the chill in the air. She pulled her arms around herself, trying to preserve warmth. Without thinking, Ethan took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. His fingers brushed the delicate curve of her neck as he adjusted the fabric, and for the first time since their marriage, there was no tension in his movements. He wasn't the arrogant businessman who manipulated everyone around him. He was just a man, doing something simple, something human. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at him. His eyes were searching hers, as if he were looking for something he hadn't been able to find in the cold, polished world he inhabited. For a split second, their gazes locked, and Lily felt her heart skip a beat. There was no mask, no barriers, just a fleeting moment of connection. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She didn't need to say more. The warmth of the jacket, the quiet intimacy between them spoke volumes. Ethan felt his heart give an uncomfortable lurch in his chest. His mouth was dry, his mind a whirlpool of conflicting emotions. He had never felt this way, this gentleness, for anyone. Least of all a stranger he had married for one night. He was always the one in control, always the one calling the shots. But here, in this room with Lily, he was the one who felt exposed. Lily looked at him with innocent eyes, her expression soft with gratitude, and in that moment something inside Ethan shifted. It wasn't the lust he'd experienced before, those fleeting physical urges. No, this was different. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. Vulnerability. For the first time in years, he felt as though he could let his guard down. With her. "Lily," his voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat. "You're not like anyone I've ever met." She smiled, a quiet, understanding smile. "I think that's the point." He didn't know how much time passed. It didn't matter. The world outside this room didn't exist anymore. All that mattered was the connection that had quietly, without warning, formed between them. The weight of the night lifted, and as the minutes stretched on, Ethan realized something he had never thought possible. He didn't want her to leave. Not tomorrow. Not ever. As he sat there beside her, his jacket wrapped around her small frame, the most unexpected truth settled into his heart. This, one night, this arranged marriage, had turned his world upside down, and he had no idea what to do about it. The morning light filtered in through the curtains of the Blackwood estate, casting a soft glow on the polished floors and marble walls. Ethan Blackwood woke with a start, a tension in his chest that he couldn't shake off. He was drenched in sweat, the remnants of a restless night clinging to his skin. His dreams had been filled with flashes of Lily, her eyes, her smile, the way she had looked at him when he wrapped his jacket around her shoulders. It was supposed to be simple, just a contract. One night, no strings attached, but the events of the previous evening had unraveled something inside him that he couldn't ignore. Something that scared him more than anything else. He dragged himself out of bed and walked to the window, the cool morning air doing nothing to settle the chaos in his mind. He had spent his entire life building an empire, becoming a man who had everything, except the one thing he truly needed: control. And now, Lily Hart, the girl who had nothing, was unraveling him. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. He could already feel the weight of the inevitable confrontation looming over him. He knew what he had to do. He needed to shut this down before it went any further, because if he didn't, if he let himself feel anything for her, it would make everything more complicated. And Ethan Blackwood didn't do complicated. Ethan paced in his room, frustration building in his chest. How could he have let his guard down like that? Last night, when he had wrapped his jacket around Lily's shoulders, when he had spoken to her like a human being instead of a business transaction, it had felt right. And that scared him more than anything. His heart pounded in his chest as he remembered the softness in her eyes when she looked up at him, that raw, unguarded moment between them. She had thanked him with such sincerity, and in that moment he had felt like he mattered to her. But he couldn't let it mean anything. He would have to shut it down, put up his walls again, and push her as far away as possible. There was no room in his life for softness, for vulnerability. His fingers clenched into fists as he walked toward the door. He was a businessman, not some emotional fool. And yet, here he was, about to confront the one person who had the power to make him feel something. When he entered the living room, he found Lily sitting by the window, her delicate figure silhouetted against the soft light. She looked peaceful, almost ethereal, her eyes lost in thought as she stared out at the vast city below. She didn't notice him at first. The silence between them was suffocating, but Ethan didn't break it. Instead, he stood there for a moment watching her, his heart beating too loudly in his chest. "Lily," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She turned, her face lighting up with a soft, tentative smile. But there was something else in her eyes, something that made his chest tighten. She was looking at him like she had the night before, as though he mattered, as though he could be someone. "Good morning, Ethan," she said, her voice still warm, still full of kindness. Ethan's jaw tightened. He was getting too close to this. The warmth in her voice, the sincerity, it was dangerous. He couldn't afford to let it pull him in any deeper. "Listen," he began, his tone sharp, more cutting than he intended. "I need to make something very clear. This," he waved a hand between them, "this marriage, this arrangement, don't think for a second that it means anything. It's just business, and that's all it will ever be. Got it?" Lily blinked, her smile faltering slightly. There was a brief flash of confusion in her eyes, followed by a faint pain that she quickly masked. Her shoulders sagged a little, as if the weight of his words had settled heavily on her. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, but there was something in her eyes that made Ethan's chest tighten again. It was the same hurt he had seen the night before when he had walked away too quickly after their moment. The same hurt he had now caused again, but he didn't let himself show it. He couldn't. The walls were going back up. Lily stood up slowly, her hands smoothing over the soft fabric of her dress, as if trying to compose herself. She had expected this, hadn't she? She had known from the beginning that Ethan Blackwood wasn't the kind of man to open up to anyone. He wasn't the kind of man to let anyone in. But for a brief moment, the night before, she had dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, he was more than what he appeared to be. Her heart ached as she looked at him. She wanted to ask him why he had been kind to her last night, why he had wrapped his jacket around her, why he had looked at her with something she couldn't name in his eyes. But she already knew the answer. He had only done it because he felt some fleeting moment of compassion. It didn't mean anything. Not to him. Not in the grand scheme of things. "I'll get breakfast ready," she said, her voice soft but steady. She turned toward the kitchen, trying to mask the pain that threatened to overwhelm her. Ethan watched her walk away, a pang of regret twisting inside him. But he quickly buried it, pushing the feeling down, trying to focus on the cold, familiar anger that kept him grounded. He had done what needed to be done, hadn't he? He had protected himself just like he always did. But as Lily disappeared into the other room, something gnawed at him, something that wouldn't let him go. As the minutes passed, Ethan found himself in the same place, alone, cold, empty. He could hear the soft sound of Lily moving around in the kitchen, the quiet hum of her presence, a stark contrast to the emptiness he felt inside. He had pushed her away. And though his pride had screamed at him to do so, a deeper part of him felt like he had made a mistake he wasn't sure he could undo. He had seen it in her eyes, the way her face had fallen, the subtle way she had pulled back. It wasn't just the sting of his words, it was the realization that she had started to care. And in pushing her away, he had shown her that he didn't care at all. But that wasn't true, was it? He did care. He didn't want her to leave, didn't want to be alone again. But the fear of being vulnerable, of letting someone in, was far too strong. So he had pushed her away, thinking it would make everything easier. But now, in the silence that stretched between them, he couldn't help but feel like he had just destroyed the only chance he had to feel something real. The breakfast table was set, the silverware glinting in the soft morning light, but neither of them touched it. Ethan stared at his coffee, his thoughts racing. He knew what he had done. He had shoved Lily away to protect himself, to keep her from getting too close. But the more he thought about it, the more the mistake burned at him. Lily had been nothing but kind to him. She hadn't asked for anything. She hadn't demanded anything from him. All she had offered was her warmth, her sincerity, and he had slapped it away like it meant nothing. A part of him wanted to apologize, to tell her he hadn't meant it, that the coldness had been a defense mechanism, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Not yet. Lily, for her part, hadn't said a word. She had taken his words in stride, nodding in acceptance, hiding the hurt behind a calm mask. She would survive this, just like she had survived everything else. She would leave when the contract was over, and she wouldn't look back. But deep inside, a small part of her wondered, would he ever regret it? Would he ever look at her and see her as something more than a business transaction? Her heart whispered that he might, but the pragmatic part of her knew better. The grand ballroom was alive with the soft murmur of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the faint echo of a classical string quartet playing in the corner. The glittering chandeliers above cast a warm, golden glow over the sea of elegant gowns and tuxedos. Ethan Blackwood stood at the edge of the room, a glass of champagne in hand, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. The charity gala was supposed to be nothing more than a formality, a way to maintain his polished public image, a way to remind people of his power, his wealth, and the status he had worked tirelessly to build. But tonight, his attention wasn't on the event. It wasn't on the guests, the speeches, or the auction that would soon begin. No, his focus had shifted. It had settled on one person, Lily Hart, his so-called wife, the woman he had married for a mere night, a contract to fulfill a foolish promise to his grandfather. She wasn't supposed to matter. He had made that clear. He had pushed her away, snapped at her, made her believe that everything between them was business and nothing more. But tonight, she was here, by his side. And something in him was starting to shift again, something he couldn't control, something that was slowly unraveling the walls he had spent years building around his heart. Ethan watched her across the room, her laugh ringing out like music as she spoke to a man in a sharp black tuxedo. She was radiant in a simple yet elegant midnight blue dress that hugged her figure perfectly, the fabric catching the light every time she moved. Her hair was swept into an elegant updo, soft tendrils framing her face, and her eyes, those soft, expressive eyes, sparkled with something he hadn't seen before. Lily was enjoying herself. She was laughing, engaging with the people around her, and for the first time since their strange arrangement had begun, she looked alive. But it wasn't just her radiance that caught his attention. It was the man she was speaking to. The stranger was tall, dark-haired, and handsome in a way that only a man with a certain level of confidence could achieve. And he was laughing with her, leaning in a little too close, his hand brushing her arm as they spoke. Ethan's grip on his champagne flute tightened, his jaw clenching involuntarily. He couldn't tear his gaze away, couldn't shake the discomfort stirring in his chest. Why did it bother him so much? Why did he care? This was supposed to be nothing. Lily was just a contract, just a way to fulfill an obligation. And yet, seeing her laugh with another man, seeing that smile that was no longer just for him, it did something to him. It stirred a strange, unfamiliar feeling deep in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name, but that was as sharp as it was powerful. As he watched them talk, Ethan's chest tightened, and a wave of irritation surged through him. The man's hand was still on her arm, brushing her skin, as if they shared some kind of connection. Lily was oblivious to the effect it was having on him, of course. She was too lost in the conversation to notice his increasingly sharp gaze, but Ethan could feel the jealousy rising within him like an uncontrollable tide. It was ridiculous. He had no claim over her. She wasn't his. Not really. He had made that clear to her, time and time again. He had pushed her away, snapped at her, kept his distance, but now, as he watched another man smile at her, as he saw her respond with that same warm, open expression she had given him last night, Ethan realized something he hadn't dared acknowledge. He didn't want any other man looking at her like that. He didn't want anyone else to make her laugh, to steal the attention he had, however briefly, been able to capture. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his breath coming a little faster. What the hell was happening to him? He didn't know. He didn't care. But the feeling only intensified as the man leaned in closer, and Lily responded by tilting her head, laughing softly at something he had said. That was enough. Ethan couldn't stand it anymore. Without thinking, he strode across the room toward them, his mind filled with a mix of anger and possessiveness he didn't understand. He could hear the man's deep voice, the low laughter, and the way Lily was smiling back, as if she were enjoying the attention far too much. The jealousy was consuming him now, boiling over like an unstoppable wave. When he reached them, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lily's wrist hard, pulling her toward him with surprising force. Her breath hitched in surprise, and she spun around, her eyes wide as she looked up at him. "Ethan?" she asked. Confusion and concern etched into her features. Ethan barely registered the question. His gaze was locked on the other man, who was still standing there, dumbfounded by Ethan's sudden appearance and the force with which he had yanked Lily away. "Stay away from him," Ethan said, his voice a low growl, more forceful than he had intended. The other man took a step back, clearly unsettled, but Lily didn't flinch. She stood there, her wrist still in his grip, staring up at him with a mix of shock and confusion. "Why do you care?" Lily asked, her voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. Ethan's heart skipped a beat at the question. Why did he care? He had no idea. All he knew was that the sight of another man so close to her made something inside him twist uncomfortably, something primal, something he had never felt before. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He had no answer. He couldn't explain it, couldn't understand why the jealousy was clawing at his chest. Instead, he simply pulled her closer to him, his grip tightening on her wrist. "I don't want anyone else looking at you like that," he muttered, his voice rough, his words barely audible even to his own ears. Lily's eyes widened further, and for a moment she said nothing. The tension in the air thickened, and the room seemed to quiet around them. Ethan was panting slightly, his heart racing, but his eyes remained fixed on Lily. He could see the confusion, the uncertainty in her gaze. She was caught off guard, and he could feel the space between them widening with every passing second. Lily's heart was pounding, but she didn't pull away. She simply stood there, her wrist still in his grip, her mind spinning. She had never seen Ethan like this, so raw, so vulnerable, and the jealousy she saw in his eyes was almost palpable. It was strange, unsettling, but more than anything, it was confusing. "Ethan," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You don't get to control who I talk to." Her eyes locked onto his with a mixture of frustration and something else, something he couldn't quite identify. "You don't get to tell me who I can and can't be around. Not like this." His chest tightened, and the words that had been forming on his lips suddenly caught in his throat. He wanted to say something, to explain, to push away this gnawing feeling that she was slipping away from him, but all he could do was stare at her, his hand still gripping her wrist, the burning jealousy still simmering inside him. Lily pulled her wrist gently from his grasp, her expression unreadable. She didn't wait for him to say anything more. Instead, she stepped back, distancing herself from him in a way that seemed final, almost purposeful. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, a quiet panic beginning to set in as he realized what he'd just done. He had exposed himself, he had let his guard down, and now she was looking at him as if he had crossed a line. "I'm not yours, Ethan," she said softly, the words sinking into him like a heavy weight. The evening was quiet at Blackwood Mansion, the kind of quiet that Ethan had become accustomed to. The soft hum of the city outside, the rustle of papers in his study, and the occasional sound of footsteps echoing through the marble floors were the only interruptions. He had been working late again, always working, always busy. It was the only way to keep his mind occupied, to keep himself from thinking about her, Lily, his wife, for one night. Or so he had convinced himself. The contract had long since expired. The one-night deal was supposed to be over, and he should have forgotten her by now. But he hadn't. He couldn't. Every time he tried to push her out of his mind, every time he told himself that this was just a fleeting thing, that he had no reason to care, she was always there, her smile, her kindness. The way she made him feel things he had long buried under years of ambition and ruthless decisions, and yet despite all his attempts, he found himself unable to move on. It was late when he heard the voices. Ethan had been walking through the corridors, his mind lost in the labyrinth of business matters, when he passed the small study where his assistant, Natalie, was having an intense conversation with Lily. He froze when he heard the tone of the discussion, sharp, persuasive, and strangely urgent. Intrigued, he moved closer, leaning against the wall, listening carefully. "I know this isn't easy, Lily," Natalie's voice said, laced with the cool professionalism Ethan had come to expect from his assistant. "But I'm just saying, there's an offer on the table. You could disappear. You've already signed the contract. After that, you have no obligation to stay. I could give you a hefty sum, enough to live comfortably for years." There was a pause, and Ethan could hear the rustle of papers, the shuffle of a chair. He didn't know why, but he felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The air in the hallway felt thinner, as if it was drawing away from him, leaving him isolated. He didn't need to hear more. He knew what was coming. The money, the bribe. It was all too easy. Lily could take the money, disappear from his life, and never have to worry again. But what struck him most was the calmness with which Natalie spoke. There was no guilt, no hesitation. She had clearly made up her mind that it was the best option for Lily, that she could just take the money and leave, and that would be the end of it. And yet, something deep inside him, something raw and vulnerable, itched at the thought. He didn't want that. He didn't want her to leave. He had no idea why, but it was a truth that was gnawing at him, something he couldn't ignore. It was then that Lily's voice cut through the stillness. "No!" The word was sharp, resolute, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, no?" Natalie's voice had a note of disbelief. "This is a great opportunity, Lily. You'll never have to struggle again. Think about it, all the money you'll need. You can disappear from this life and start fresh. You won't ever have to worry about being homeless again." But Lily didn't waver. Her voice, though soft, carried an unshakable strength. "I don't care about money," she said, her words hanging in the air like a declaration of independence. "I'd rather be homeless again than be treated like I'm for sale. I'm not someone's commodity." Ethan felt the breath leave his lungs. He didn't realize it at first, but his chest had tightened, the weight of her words settling over him in an unexpected way. For a moment, it was as if the entire world had frozen. His mind raced, trying to process what he had just heard. Lily's words echoed in his mind. "I'd rather be homeless again than be treated like I'm for sale." The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, an empire builder, a man who had made his fortune by owning everything, controlling everything, including people in his life. Money had always been the answer, the way to buy whatever he wanted, fix whatever was broken, and dispose of whatever he no longer needed. People were like assets, easily discarded when they no longer served a purpose. But Lily wasn't like that. She wasn't motivated by money, and she wouldn't allow herself to be bought. She had more integrity in her little finger than Ethan had in his entire body. Her response cut through him like a blade, and for the first time he felt something deep and painful that he couldn't ignore. She had been homeless. She had nothing. And yet, despite all that, she still valued herself more than he could ever have imagined. Ethan stepped back, retreating from the doorway as if he had been burned. His pulse was racing and his mind was in turmoil. Why was this bothering him so much? Why did it hurt to hear her say that? The more Ethan thought about it, the more the truth of her words hit him like a freight train. She wasn't looking for comfort or convenience. She wasn't seeking a handout. She wasn't playing the role of a typical gold digger, a woman who would easily fall into the trap of money and luxury. She was different. She had refused an easy way out. She had rejected the offer with a quiet dignity, an unspoken strength that he couldn't quite place, but which fascinated him more than he cared to admit. He stood there in the dark hallway, the weight of his own realization sinking in. Ethan had built a life based on power and control. He had manipulated situations, used people for his own gain, and buried his emotions under a veneer of indifference. But Lily had thrown that all into sharp relief. She wasn't a prize to be won or discarded. She was a person who had her own sense of worth, her own rules, and her own boundaries. And in that moment, Ethan realized how little he truly understood about her, how little he had allowed himself to understand. The next morning, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest. He had to confront her. He had to speak to her, but the words felt heavy, too heavy to be said out loud. What was he going to say? He had always been so sure of himself, so confident in his ability to control every situation. But with Lily, it was different. He had never felt this kind of vulnerability before, and it terrified him. He found her in the garden, sitting on one of the stone benches, staring out over the manicured lawns. Her posture was relaxed, but her face was unreadable, as if she had been lost in thought. When he approached, she didn't look up. She didn't need to. She knew he was there. "Lily," he began, his voice low, unsure. "About what happened last night?" She turned to him then, her eyes steady and calm. "You overheard?" Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice betraying a vulnerability he hadn't planned on showing. "I didn't mean for you to feel like that." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something he wasn't sure he could give. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke. "It's not about you, Ethan," she said softly. "It's about me. I don't want to be something that can be bought or sold. I'm not that kind of person." Her words hit him like a slap to the face. The reality of it all came crashing down on him. This wasn't just about money or contracts or obligations. This was about respect, about seeing her for who she truly was. And in that moment, Ethan realized that he might have just lost her, and he wasn't sure if he could fix it. Ethan stood there, at a crossroads he had never anticipated. He had never been forced to make a decision like this before. His entire life had been built on choices made from a place of power, control, and cold logic. But with Lily, it was different. She had challenged him in ways he never expected. If he wanted her to stay, if he wanted her to be a part of his life, he knew he would have to change. He would have to give up the comfort of his empire, the cold, calculated detachment that had defined him for so long. And for the first time, he realized, he didn't want to lose her. Not now, not ever. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that settled like a dense fog over everything Ethan could think of. His mind was a whirlwind, confused, restless, and far from the cool, controlled persona he had always maintained. He had spent hours pacing through the grand hallways of Blackwood Mansion, wrestling with emotions he had long since buried under layers of ice. But now, there was no escaping it. He had to confront the truth. He had to face what was growing inside him. Lily had rejected the money, and that thought tormented him in ways he didn't want to admit. His mind replayed her words. "I'd rather be homeless again than be treated like I'm for sale." The confidence, the fire in her eyes when she spoke, it had unsettled him. It wasn't about the money or the luxury he could offer. It was about her. It was about the fact that she valued herself more than any amount of wealth he could throw at her. It was about the way she had seen through him, through his armor, through his pride, through everything he had convinced himself made him invincible. Her refusal had peeled back the layers he had carefully crafted around himself, exposing a vulnerability he had never allowed anyone to see, a vulnerability he didn't know how to deal with. His footsteps echoed as he stormed down the long corridor toward her room. The sharp sound of his shoes clicking against the marble floor was the only thing breaking the eerie silence. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say, but the words had been building up inside him, pressing against his chest. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about something deeper. It was about what she had come to mean to him, and the terrifying realization that he might lose her if he didn't act. As he reached her door, his hand hesitated on the handle for just a moment. A fleeting thought passed through his mind. What if she didn't want to talk? What if she didn't want him to speak to her at all? But the thought was fleeting. He couldn't stop now. Not after everything that had happened. He couldn't let her walk away from him without saying what needed to be said. He swung the door open, almost slamming it against the wall, and there she was, sitting by the window, the soft glow of the moonlight illuminating her delicate features. She didn't seem surprised. In fact, she didn't even flinch. She simply turned to face him, her eyes calm, but unreadable. Ethan's breath came out in a sharp hiss. "Why didn't you take the money?" The words came out harder than he intended, as if accusing her. The question had been clawing at him for hours, and now it spilled out like a dam breaking. "Why the hell didn't you take it?" Lily didn't flinch, didn't react with the defensiveness he'd expected. Instead, she looked at him with those wide, unguarded eyes that always seemed to see right through him, to pierce into the very core of his being. She didn't hesitate before speaking, her voice calm but firm. "Because I didn't want to leave you," she said, her words soft but strong, like a declaration. The world seemed to stop for a moment, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stood frozen, his mind reeling. Did she just say that? He had expected many things from her, but this was unexpected. For a moment he was speechless. The gravity of her words settled over him like a weight, pressing against his chest. She didn't want to leave him. She hadn't taken the money because, despite everything, she wanted to stay. It felt like a punch to his gut. And yet there was something in those words that reached deep inside him. Lily's gaze never wavered, and there was a quiet sincerity in her eyes that made his pulse quicken. She wasn't playing games, she wasn't pretending, she was telling him the truth. A truth that, for the first time, made him question everything he had known about himself, about her, about what he wanted. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time in his life, he was completely speechless. His mind was spinning, his emotions were a mess, and he couldn't find a single thing to say that would make any sense. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every situation, to manipulate the world around him with a cold, calculating precision. But with Lily, nothing made sense. Nothing was in his control anymore. She had no reason to want him. He was a man of ice and ambition, someone who had never cared for anything other than building his empire. She was warm, kind-hearted, someone who had nothing but the strength of her spirit. So why? Why would she choose to stay? The answer hit him like a revelation, because of her heart, because of what she sees in me. And then, for the first time in his life, he felt fear. Fear not of losing his wealth, his power, or his control, but of losing her. The realization was gut-wrenching. He couldn't imagine a life without her. He couldn't bear the thought of her walking out of this room and never coming back. He took a step forward, then another, drawn to her like a magnet. His heart raced, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. He didn't care about anything except the overwhelming need to feel her close, to make sure she understood how much she meant to him. Without thinking, without even realizing what he was doing, Ethan reached out for her. His fingers brushed against her arm, and before she could respond, he leaned in and kissed her. The kiss was slow at first, tentative as if neither of them were sure what to expect. Ethan's lips found hers with a gentleness he had never shown anyone before. But there was a hunger behind it, a raw, desperate longing that had built up over days, weeks, maybe even months without him realizing it. Lily didn't pull away. Instead, she kissed him back, her lips soft and warm against his. There was a softness in her touch that made his heart ache. She wasn't scared, not like he had expected. She wasn't running away. She was right there, with him, as if she had always belonged there. Ethan's hands found their way to her waist, pulling her closer. The world around them seemed to vanish as the kiss deepened, growing in intensity with every passing second. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest, the warmth of her body as it pressed against his, and everything that had been tangled up inside him started to unravel. He wasn't Ethan Blackwood, the ruthless businessman, anymore. He was just a man who had finally realized what it meant to love someone, to want them with all his being. He didn't know how this had happened, didn't know how she had gotten under his skin, but he couldn't deny it anymore. He couldn't fight it. The kiss finally broke, but neither of them moved away. They stood there, forehead to forehead, breathing heavily, hearts pounding in unison. Ethan could feel the warmth of her breath on his skin, the trembling of her body as it pressed against his fingers tangled in her hair, his grip tightening as if he were afraid she might slip away. He couldn't find the words to explain what he was feeling. He didn't know how to tell her that everything had changed in that one breathtaking moment, that everything he had believed about love, about emotions, had been shattered the second he kissed her, but there was no need for words. Because in that moment, they both understood. They understood the unspoken connection between them, the truth that had been hiding beneath the surface all along. Ethan started, but his voice faltered. He didn't need to say it. She already knew. They both did. Lily's hand reached up to touch his cheek, her fingers soft and gentle. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, her voice breaking the silence. "I'm here, with you." And just like that, everything changed. Forever. The morning after their kiss, Ethan awoke to a strange and unsettling silence. The kind of silence that gripped his chest and made every breath feel heavier than the last. It was still early, the soft light of dawn barely creeping through the curtains, casting long shadows across the grand room. His mind was foggy, his body still sore from the emotions that had surged through him the night before. He had kissed her, Lily, and it had felt real, more real than anything he had ever experienced in his life. For the first time, he had allowed himself to feel something, anything. But now that the haze of passion had cleared, doubt crept in. He was Ethan Blackwood, and men like him didn't fall in love. Men like him didn't lose control, didn't let their emotions dictate their actions. Love was a weakness, a vulnerability he couldn't afford. The more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that he had made a grave mistake. He had let his guard down, and he couldn't allow that to happen again. No, he thought to himself, as he lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. She's just a contract, nothing more. The kiss had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment. He had been vulnerable for a moment, but he would fix that. He could fix it. When he finally gathered the strength to get out of bed, the first thing he did was head straight for her room. He needed to make sure everything was clear, that there were no lingering misunderstandings. When he opened the door, he saw her there, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hair messily cascading around her shoulders. She was wearing a soft, pale blue robe, her eyes distant as she stared out the window, her expression unreadable. Ethan's heart tightened at the sight of her, at the reminder of the night before, but his mind quickly snapped back into place. He couldn't afford to be weak. He couldn't afford to let her think there was more to what had happened. "Lily," he said, his voice cold and commanding, betraying none of the tumultuous emotions swirling inside him. She turned to face him slowly, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity that made his heart skip. But he couldn't let that affect him, he couldn't. That kiss meant nothing, he said, his words sharp, each one like a dagger being driven deeper. The words hit her like a thunderclap, their force crashing into her chest. It felt like the ground beneath her feet had disappeared, like the air had been knocked from her lungs. For a moment, she just stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. The words didn't make sense. How could he say that? She wondered, her mind spinning. She had believed, no, she had hoped, that the kiss had meant something, that there was something between them, something real. But now, in the cold light of morning, she saw the truth. Ethan was still the same man he had been when she first met him, ruthless, distant, incapable of feeling anything genuine. For a long moment, she said nothing. She simply stood there, staring at him, feeling the raw, stinging ache of betrayal rip through her heart. She had opened herself to him, had allowed herself to believe in the impossible, and now, in the blink of an eye, all of it was gone. Her hands trembled as she slowly reached for the bag she'd packed the night before. She'd known, deep down, that this moment would come. She'd known that Ethan would push her away. After all, he was a man who thrived on control, who feared nothing more than losing it. But hearing him say those words, that kiss meant nothing, was a blow she hadn't expected. As she turned to leave, she caught a fleeting glimpse of Ethan's face, the mask of indifference slipping for just a moment. It was almost as if he regretted what he had said. But the moment passed and his cold, impassive demeanor returned. Lily didn't look back as she walked out of the room, her heart breaking with each step. She had given him everything, her trust, her heart, her love. But it had all been in vain. She had been a fool to believe that someone like him could change. She had allowed herself to dream of a life with him, a life where she wasn't just the poor girl who had been bought and sold. But now she realized she had been nothing more than a pawn in his game, a means to an end. Her tears were silent as she left the mansion, her heart heavy with the weight of betrayal. She didn't want to cry, didn't want to show him how much his words had shattered her, but the tears came anyway, coursing down her cheeks as she stepped out into the cold, harsh world she had tried so hard to escape. Ethan, meanwhile, was left standing in the middle of the room, the echoes of his words still ringing in his ears. He had done what he needed to do, what he had convinced himself was the right thing. He had pushed her away before she could get too close, before she could hurt him, and yet, even as the thought crossed his mind, a part of him, a small, vulnerable part, wasn't so sure. He couldn't explain it. The moment she left, something inside him had shattered. He had expected the emptiness to feel familiar. He had expected the cold, the solitude, the distance to soothe him, but it didn't. Instead, it gnawed at him, digging deeper and deeper with every passing minute. The mansion, once a symbol of power and success, now felt like a prison. The silence was deafening, the vast empty rooms oppressive. He wandered through the halls, his footsteps hollow in the vast emptiness. The weight of his decision settled over him like a blanket, suffocating him with its heaviness. He had pushed her away. He had rejected the one person who had truly seen him for who he was, who had broken through his walls and made him feel something real. And now she was gone. When Ethan returned to the grand living room, the realization hit him like a sledgehammer. The space was cold, too cold. It was as if the very air had turned against him. He had built this empire, had fought tooth and nail to achieve everything he had. But in this moment, none of it mattered. He had lost something. No, he had lost her. His heart raced as he realized the extent of his mistake. He had been so focused on keeping his pride intact, on protecting himself from the vulnerability she had exposed, that he had pushed her away. But now, it was too late. She was gone, and there was no taking back the words he had spoken. He sank down onto the leather sofa, his hands buried in his hair as his chest tightened with a mix of frustration and regret. What have I done? Ethan Blackwood had conquered cities, toppled empires, and faced adversaries with ruthless precision. But in this moment, as he sat in the cold silence of his mansion, he realized that he had never been more helpless. Ethan Blackwood had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life. As the head of one of the most influential empires in the world, he had shaped his destiny with ruthless precision. But now, as he sat in his car outside the familiar cafe where Lily had once sat alone, dreaming of a life she would never have, he realized he had lost control in the most significant way possible. He had lost her. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and regret, but one thing had become crystal clear in the chaos: he couldn't live without her. The cold indifference that had once been his shield now felt like a prison, and he would do anything to break free from it. He had pushed her away out of fear, out of pride, but that decision had only left him with an aching emptiness he couldn't ignore any longer. As he stepped out of the car and into the street, he moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the cafe. The same cafe where, just weeks ago, he had seen her sitting alone, lost in her thoughts. It seemed almost impossible to believe how much had changed since that day. He had been so certain of his control over everything, his wealth, his power, his life. Yet, in the end, it was love that had turned his world upside down. He pushed the door open and stepped into the cozy cafe, his heart pounding in his chest. It was early in the morning and the place was quiet, save for a few regulars sipping their coffee. And there, in the corner, was Lily. She was sitting at a small table by the window, her head down as she absent-mindedly stirred her coffee. The same soft, graceful woman who had once been invisible to him, now the most important person in his world. Lily didn't notice him at first. She looked different now. Her eyes were weary, but there was still that same warmth in them, even after everything. And then, as if sensing his presence, she looked up. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan felt his heart tighten, the weight of his own guilt pressing down on him. He had betrayed her, hurt her, and now, standing in front of her, he had no idea how to make it right. But he had to try. "I was wrong," Ethan's voice cracked as he spoke, the words raw and vulnerable in a way he had never allowed himself to be before. His hands shook, but he didn't care. He needed her to understand. "I was scared to love you." He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "But I can't live without you, Lily. I'm nothing without you." Lily's heart skipped a beat. For a moment she felt as though time itself had stopped. She had never imagined hearing those words from Ethan, never thought he would admit let alone say them aloud. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. Was this really happening? Her heart wanted to believe it, but the pain of his earlier rejection still stung, lingering in her chest like a fresh wound. The fear of being hurt again, of being pushed away once more, kept her from rushing into his arms. "How do I know you won't push me away again?" she asked quietly, her voice laced with doubt. The last time she'd trusted him, she had walked away with nothing but a broken heart and a sense of betrayal. She couldn't go through that again. Ethan felt his chest constrict. He knew that his words alone wouldn't be enough to erase the pain he had caused her. He had to show her, he had to prove to her that he was willing to change, that he was willing to be vulnerable for her. For them. Without thinking, he dropped to one knee in front of her, right there, in the middle of the cafe, as the small group of patrons looked on in surprise. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he knew this was the only way to prove to her that he was serious. "Marry me," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "For real. Forever." Lily's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she looked down at him, her mind spinning. Was this really happening? Was Ethan Blackwood, the man who had once been so cold and unfeeling, now kneeling before her, offering her his heart? Tears welled in her eyes as the truth sank in. She had never imagined a grand gesture like this, and certainly not from someone like him. She had always believed that people like Ethan didn't change, that they remained the same, locked in their fear and pride. But here he was, vulnerable and sincere, asking her to take a leap of faith with him. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. She was afraid that this could be a fleeting moment of weakness, that once the excitement of the gesture wore off, he would go back to being the man he was before. But deep down, she knew this was different. She could see it in his eyes. She could feel it in the way he was looking at her, like he was seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her, not as a contract or a pawn, but as the woman he loved. Tears slid down her cheeks as she reached out to take his hand, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The words were simple, but they were the truest words she had ever spoken. This time, it wasn't for money or security. It wasn't because she had to, or because she had nowhere else to go. This time, she was saying yes, because she loved him. She loved him more than she had ever loved anyone, more than she had ever thought possible. Ethan's heart soared as he pulled her into his arms, his lips crashing against hers in a kiss that was full of passion, of love, and of all the emotions they had both been holding back for so long. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a promise. A promise that they would face the future together, no matter the obstacles, no matter the pain of the past. The cafe patrons watched in stunned silence. And then, as the two lovers embraced, they erupted into applause. It didn't matter that it was unexpected or unconventional. What mattered was that Ethan Blackwood, the billionaire who had once prided himself on being untouchable, had finally allowed himself to love. And Lily, the girl who had once been nothing, had become the woman who had changed his world. As they stood there in the center of the cafe, wrapped in each other's arms, they both knew that this was just the beginning. They had conquered their pride, their fears, and their past. And together, they would face the future, forever entwined. In the end, love had triumphed, had broken down the walls Ethan had spent years building around himself, and had healed the wounds Lily had carried for so long. They were no longer just two people caught in a contract, bound by obligation. They were partners, equals, and above all, they were in love. The journey they had shared was not easy, but it was theirs. And together they would face whatever came next, hand in hand, hearts open, and love as their guide.